The morning mist hung heavy over Millfield County when the bulldozers arrived at Harold Brennan's farm. For 3 months, the development company had offered increasingly desperate sums for his 200-acre property, but the 78-year-old farmer wouldn't budge, not even when they offered $10 million for land that barely grew corn anymore. Harold watched from his kitchen window as the yellow machines lined up like mechanical vultures along his property line. Their diesel engines rumbled impatiently, waiting for the signal that would never come. His weathered hands wrapped around a coffee mug that had lost its handle years ago, steam rising to fog his wire-rimmed glasses. The lead foreman, a burly man in a hard hat, climbed down from the first bulldozer and approached the farmhouse. Harold could see the clipboard in his hand, probably holding court orders or condemnation papers. They'd tried everything else, bribes, threats, lawyers. Now came the muscle. "Mr. Brennan," the foreman called out, his voice carrying across the yard. "We need to talk." Harold didn't move from the window. Behind him, the house creaked with memories. Every floorboard, every paint chip told the story of 4 generations of Brennans who'd worked this soil. His great-grandfather had cleared these fields with nothing but an axe and determination. His grandfather had survived the Depression by growing victory gardens. His father had built the farm into something approaching prosperity. And his father had built other things too. Things Harold tried not to think about during the long winter nights when the wind howled through the gaps in the barn walls. "Mr. Brennan, I know you're in there. We've got legal authority here." Through the kitchen window, Harold could see straight across the yard to the collapsed barn. From the outside, it looked like 40 years of neglect had finally won. The roof sagged dangerously, held up by rotted beams and stubborn faith. Weeds grew through cracks in the foundation. Rust stained the walls like dried blood. But Harold knew better. Beneath the carefully orchestrated decay, beneath the strategically placed hay bales and deliberately scattered junk, sat his father's greatest achievement. And his greatest shame. 12 cars, each one a masterpiece of engineering and design, each one worth a fortune to the right collector, each one carrying secrets that had haunted Harold for 4 decades. He remembered the night his father had died, how the old man's last words weren't about love or forgiveness, but about the barn. "Never let them look in the barn, boy," his father had whispered through morphine and regret. "Some secrets die with their keepers." The knocking grew more insistent. Harold set down his coffee and walked to the front door, his joints protesting with each step. Through the peephole he could see the foreman's impatient face, red from cold and frustration. "What do you want?" Harold called through the door. "Legal papers, Mr. Brennan. Eminent domain proceedings. You can read them yourself, but the bottom line is, we're breaking ground next Monday, whether you cooperate or not." Harold opened the door just wide enough to accept the envelope. Inside were documents with enough legal jargon to choke a lawyer, but the meaning was clear. The county had declared his property essential for economic development. He had 1 week to evacuate. "This is still America," Harold said. "A man's supposed to have rights on his own land." The foreman's expression softened slightly. "Look, Mr. Brennan, I know this is hard, but $10 million? That's enough to buy a nice place somewhere and live comfortably for the rest of your days. Why are you fighting this?" Harold glanced toward the barn, then back at the foreman. How could he explain 40 years of carrying his father's secrets? How could he describe the weight of protecting something that might destroy everything he'd built if it ever came to light? "Some things aren't for sale," Harold said finally. The foreman shook his head and walked back toward the bulldozers. Harold closed the door and leaned against it, feeling every one of his 78 years. In 1 week, those machines would tear through his property like mechanical locusts. They'd demolish the house, level the fields, and eventually, inevitably, reach the barn. And when they did, the whole world would discover what Harold Brennan had spent 4 decades trying to forget. He walked back to the kitchen window and stared at the barn. Somewhere in the distance, a siren wailed. Police or ambulance, he couldn't tell. The sound seemed fitting somehow, like an early warning of the chaos about to descend on his quiet farm. 1 week. 7 days to decide whether his father's legacy was worth destroying his family's future. The morning sun cast long shadows across the farmyard as Harold Bentley walked the perimeter of his property, coffee mug in hand. The developer's business card crinkled in his shirt pocket with each step, a constant reminder of yesterday's unwelcome visitors. $23 million. The number had kept him awake most of the night, not because he was tempted, but because it made him wonder what they really wanted. His boots crunched through the frost-covered grass as he made his way toward the old barn that had been sealed since his father's death 15 years ago. The massive wooden structure leaned slightly to the east, its red paint peeling like dried blood. Harold had always meant to tear it down, but something had held him back. Maybe it was sentiment, or maybe it was the way his father had made him promise never to let strangers poke around the property. The padlock on the barn door was rusty but solid. Harold had checked it countless times over the years, though he couldn't quite explain why. His father had been secretive about the barn's contents, claiming it housed old farm equipment too broken to use and too sentimental to throw away. Harold had accepted this explanation as a child and never questioned it as an adult. Until now. The coffee grew cold in his hands as he stared at the weathered doors. What could possibly be inside that would justify such an enormous offer? The farmland was decent, but nothing special. The house needed extensive repairs, and the smaller outbuildings were in various states of decay. But this barn was different. It was built like a fortress, with thick stone foundations and reinforced walls. A car engine interrupted his thoughts. Harold turned to see a black sedan pulling up his driveway, moving slowly and deliberately. His stomach tightened as two men in dark suits emerged from the vehicle. They weren't the same developers from yesterday, but they carried themselves with the same predatory confidence. "Mr. Bentley," the taller man called out as they approached. "My name is Marcus Webb. I represent certain interested parties regarding your property." Harold set his coffee mug on a fence post and crossed his arms. "If you're here to make another offer, you're wasting your time." Webb smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Actually, we're here to discuss the historical significance of your land. You see, we've been researching property records from the 1970s and 80s. Your father, Thomas Bentley, was quite the entrepreneur during those years." "My father was a farmer," Harold said carefully. "Of course," the second man chimed in. He was shorter and rounder than Webb, with nervous energy that made Harold uneasy, but he also had connections to the classic car restoration business. Very lucrative work, especially for someone with his particular skills. Harold's mouth went dry. He remembered his father disappearing for days at a time, claiming he was helping friends with mechanical work. The family had always needed the extra income, so Harold's mother never questioned where the money came from. But looking back, the amounts had seemed generous for simple repair jobs. "What exactly are you implying?" Harold asked. Webb stepped closer, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Let's just say that some very valuable items went missing during that era, items that were never recovered. Insurance companies paid out millions in claims, but the cars themselves seemed to vanish without a trace." The blood drained from Harold's face. "You're suggesting my father was a thief?" "I'm suggesting your father was a practical man who understood opportunity when it presented itself," Webb corrected. "The question is, where did those opportunities lead him?" Harold's gaze drifted involuntarily toward the sealed barn, and he caught Webb following his line of sight. The developer's smile widened with satisfaction. "That's an impressive structure," Webb observed. "Built to last. Built to protect valuable things from the elements and from prying eyes." "You need to leave," Harold said, but his voice lacked conviction. "We will," Webb assured him. "But think about our conversation, Mr. Bentley. Think about what might be hidden on this property and what it could mean for your future. The people we represent are patient, but they're not infinitely patient." The two men walked back to their car with leisurely confidence, as if they'd already won whatever game they were playing. Harold watched them drive away, his hands shaking slightly as he retrieved his coffee mug. When the sedan disappeared from view, Harold found himself staring at the barn again. The morning sun had climbed higher, casting the building's shadow directly over where he stood. For the first time in 15 years, he found himself seriously considering what lay behind those locked doors. His father had been many things: stubborn, secretive, sometimes bitter about the hand life had dealt him. But a car thief? Harold had never considered the possibility, yet the pieces were starting to fit together in ways that made his chest tight with dread. Walking back toward the house, Harold made a decision that would change everything. Tomorrow, he would open the barn. The rain had stopped by the time Marcus returned to the barn, but water still dripped steadily from the rusted gutters, creating a rhythm that matched his racing heartbeat. He'd spent the last hour pacing his kitchen, downing 3 cups of bitter coffee and trying to convince himself he'd imagined what he'd seen beneath that tarp. But the image burned in his mind: chrome that gleamed despite decades of neglect, paint that had somehow retained its deep burgundy luster, and that unmistakable silhouette of a 1967 Mustang Shelby GT 500, a car worth more than his entire farm. Marcus pushed open the barn door, wincing as it groaned on ancient hinges. Afternoon sunlight slanted through gaps in the weathered boards, illuminating dust motes that danced in the air like spirits. The tarp lay exactly where he'd left it, bunched up beside the car like a discarded secret. He approached slowly, his work boots echoing in the cavernous space. Up close, the Mustang was even more magnificent. The paint showed barely a trace of oxidation, protected all these years by the heavy canvas covering. Someone had cared for this machine before hiding it away. Running his fingers along the hood, Marcus felt for the familiar bump of the VIN plate. When he found it, he used his pocket knife to scrape away decades of accumulated grime. The numbers emerged slowly: 67,400 F7, a 31,849. His grandfather's notebook was back at the house, but Marcus didn't need it to remember the significance. This wasn't just any Shelby, it was one of the Super Snake variants, less than 50 ever made. If genuine, it could be worth $500,000. But that raised the question that had been gnawing at him since the discovery: how had his grandfather acquired such a car? Henry Dalton had been a simple farmer, a man who counted every penny and drove the same pickup truck for 30 years. Marcus circled the vehicle, noting details that deepened his unease. The license plates were missing, leaving only empty mounting holes. A thin layer of sawdust covered the interior, suggesting someone had tried to absorb moisture and preserve the leather seats. This wasn't a car that had been abandoned. It had been deliberately hidden. He tried the door handle and was surprised when it clicked open. The interior was pristine, the black leather supple despite its age. Papers in the glove compartment had been removed, leaving only an owner's manual and a single business card wedged behind the registration holder. Marcus extracted the card carefully. Consolidated Auto Import-Export, it read, with an address in Detroit and a phone number that began with the old exchange system. The company name meant nothing to him, but the handwritten note on the back made his blood run cold: H. Dalton. Final payment due September 1963. September 1963. Marcus did quick mental math. That was just 2 months before his grandfather had suddenly acquired enough money to save the farm from foreclosure, a financial miracle the family had always attributed to a successful crop yield and careful saving. Thunder rumbled in the distance, promising another storm. Marcus pocketed the business card and moved deeper into the barn, studying the other covered shapes with new interest. If one tarp concealed a treasure, what about the others? The second covering came away to reveal a pristine 1965 Ferrari 275 GTB, its red paint gleaming like fresh blood. The third hid a 1969 Dodge Charger RT, black as midnight with racing stripes that seemed to glow in the dim light. Each car was worth a fortune. Each car raised more questions. Marcus's hands trembled as he checked for VIN numbers, finding them either missing entirely or filed away until they were illegible. Professional work, the kind of modification that spoke of organized crime, not simple theft. A new sound made him freeze, the crunch of gravel in his driveway. Through a gap in the barn wall, he could see a black sedan pulling up to his house, expensive and out of place in the rural setting. Two men in dark suits emerged, their movements deliberate and confident. Marcus recognized the type immediately. He'd seen enough crime dramas, read enough newspapers. These weren't bill collectors or county assessors. These were the kind of men who asked questions and expected immediate answers. Moving quickly but quietly, he pulled the tarps back over the cars, his mind racing. The developer's sudden interest in his worthless property made sense now. They weren't after the land. They were after what was hidden on it. The men were approaching his front door, their footsteps clearly audible even from the barn. Marcus slipped out the back entrance, staying low as he made his way toward the tree line. Whatever business these strangers had with him, he needed time to think, time to understand what his grandfather had done and why. Behind him, the sound of knocking echoed across the farmyard, polite but insistent. When no answer came, he heard voices, calm, professional, patient. They could wait. They had waited decades already. The sound of gravel crunching under tires pulled Henry from his restless sleep at dawn. Through his bedroom window, he watched a black sedan creep up his driveway, moving with the deliberate pace of someone who didn't want to be noticed. The car stopped near the barn, and a man in an expensive suit stepped out, surveying the property with the calculating gaze of someone appraising merchandise. Henry dressed quickly and made his way downstairs, his arthritic joints protesting with each step. By the time he reached the porch, the stranger was already walking toward the house, a briefcase in one hand and a confident smile plastered across his face. "Mr. Caldwell? Marcus Webb, Webb Development Corporation." The man extended a manicured hand that Henry ignored. "I believe my associates visited you yesterday about a potential land acquisition, and I believe I told them no." Henry crossed his arms, positioning himself squarely in front of his door. "This is private property, Mr. Webb. You're trespassing." Webb's smile never wavered. "I understand your initial hesitation. It's natural to feel attached to a family property. But I'm prepared to make you an offer that reflects the true value of this land." He opened his briefcase and pulled out a folder thick with documents. $12 million, Mr. Caldwell. Cash. You could close within 30 days. The number hit Henry like a physical blow, but he kept his expression steady. 12 million. Enough to pay off every debt, to fix everything that had been broken for decades, to ensure Sarah never wanted for anything. Enough to make all his problems disappear. "My answer remains the same," he said, though his voice carried less conviction than before. Webb studied him with shrewd eyes. "You know, it's interesting. I've done my research on this property. Your family has owned it for what, 4 generations? But there are some curious gaps in the records from the 1970s and 80s. Insurance claims that were never filed. Accidents that were never reported." He paused, letting the words sink in. "Sometimes the past has a way of catching up with us, doesn't it?" Henry's blood ran cold. "What are you implying?" "I'm simply saying that development projects often uncover unexpected things. Old foundations, buried infrastructure, forgotten storage areas." Webb's tone remained conversational, but his meaning was crystal clear. It would be unfortunate if such discoveries complicated what could otherwise be a very clean, very private transaction. The two men stared at each other in silence, the morning air thick with unspoken threats. Henry's mind raced through possibilities, calculating risks, weighing consequences. This man knew something, or suspected it. The question was, how much? "I need time to think," Henry said finally. "Of course. These are big decisions." Webb handed him a business card. "But don't take too long. Market conditions change, and opportunities like this don't last forever." He snapped his briefcase shut and started walking back toward his car. "Oh, and Mr. Caldwell, you might want to consider what's best for your granddaughter. College isn't getting any cheaper, and young people deserve a chance to build their own futures, don't you think?" Henry watched the sedan disappear down the road, his hands trembling with barely controlled rage. The bastard had done his homework, knew exactly which buttons to push. But the implied threat against Sarah crossed a line that Henry wouldn't tolerate. He walked to the barn, his steps heavy with the weight of 40 years' worth of secrets. Inside, dust motes danced in the morning light, filtering through gaps in the walls. The space looked innocuous enough. Rusted farm equipment, mouldering hay bales, cobwebs draping forgotten corners. But Henry knew what lay beneath the false floor in the back corner, hidden under decades of accumulated debris. He pulled out his phone and dialed a number he hadn't called in 15 years. Murphy's garage. "Pat, it's Henry Caldwell." A long pause. "Jesus, Henry. It's been a while. I need to see you. Today. It's about the old business." Another pause, longer this time. "I thought we agreed never to." Someone's sniffing around. They know things they shouldn't know. "Shit!" Pat's voice dropped to a whisper. "How much do they know?" "I'm not sure yet, but we need to talk. Can you meet me at the usual place? Give me an hour." Henry ended the call and stared at the barn's interior, remembering the night everything changed. The phone call that had pulled him from bed, the desperate drive through winding country roads, the decision that had seemed so clear at the time but had haunted him ever since. He thought about Sarah, about the future she deserved, about the weight of choices made by desperate men in desperate times. $12 million could solve every problem except the one that mattered most. The truth had a way of demanding payment, regardless of the price anyone was willing to pay to keep it buried. The morning sun cast long shadows across the barn as Thomas Fletcher stood in the doorway, his weathered hands gripping the frame. Sleep had eluded him after yesterday's discovery, his mind churning through possibilities like a mill wheel grinding grain. The cars sat beneath their tops like sleeping giants, and he found himself both drawn to and repelled by their presence. He'd spent most of the night in his kitchen, nursing black coffee and staring at the faded photograph he'd pulled from his father's old desk, a picture of his Uncle Raymond standing beside a pristine 1957 Thunderbird, the same model that now sat hidden in the barn. Raymond had always been the mysterious one in the family, disappearing for months at a time during the 60s and 70s, showing up with expensive gifts and stories that never quite added up. Thomas stepped into the barn, his boots echoing against the concrete floor. He approached the nearest tarp and pulled it away completely, revealing the full glory of a mint-condition Jaguar E-Type. The chrome gleamed, despite decades of storage, and the British racing green paint looked as though it had been applied yesterday. This wasn't just any classic car. This was a museum piece. His fingers traced the edge of a small brass plate mounted near the driver's side door. The engraving was partially obscured by grime, but he could make out what appeared to be a registration number. Thomas grabbed an old rag and carefully cleaned the surface, revealing the full inscription, "Property of Whitmore Estate, 1968. The name hit him like a physical blow. Everyone in the county knew about the Whitmore robbery. It had been front-page news for months in 1969. Harrison Whitmore, the textile heir, had claimed that his entire collection of vintage automobiles had been stolen from his estate outside Charlotte. The insurance payout had been substantial, and the case had remained unsolved, despite a massive investigation. Thomas moved to the next car, pulling away the tarp to reveal a stunning Mercedes-Benz 300 SL Gullwing. His hands shook as he searched for and found another brass plate with similar markings, then another on the Thunderbird. All bore the Whitmore name and dates from the late 60s. The implications crashed over him like a flood. His Uncle Raymond hadn't just been involved in some petty theft. He'd been part of one of the largest auto thefts in state history. And somehow, these stolen treasures had ended up on Fletcher land, hidden away while the investigation raged and eventually went cold. The sound of tires on gravel snapped Thomas back to the present. Through the barn's side window, he saw a sleek black sedan pulling up his driveway, not Sarah's practical Honda, but something expensive and official-looking. Two men in dark suits emerged, and Thomas's stomach clenched with recognition. Federal agents by the look of them. He quickly threw the tarps back over the nearest cars. though he knew it was futile if they had a warrant. His mind raced through possibilities. Had someone seen him yesterday? Had Sarah mentioned something to someone? Or was this visit related to the development deal? The knock on his front door came 3 minutes later, crisp, authoritative raps that echoed through the old farmhouse. Thomas took a deep breath and walked slowly from the barn, each step feeling heavier than the last. Through the screen door, he could see the two men waiting patiently on his porch. "Thomas Fletcher?" The taller agent held up a leather wallet displaying his credentials. "I'm Agent Morrison, FBI. This is Agent Chen. We'd like to ask you a few questions about your property." Thomas's mouth felt dry as cotton. "What kind of questions? May we come in?" "It's regarding some information we've received about possible stolen property." The words confirmed Thomas's worst fears. Someone knew. Someone had talked. He unlatched the screen door and stepped back, gesturing them into his modest living room. The agent's eyes swept the space professionally, taking in every detail from the gun rack above the fireplace to the stack of unpaid bills on the coffee table. "Mr. Fletcher," Agent Morrison began, settling into the worn armchair without invitation, "we have reason to believe that stolen vehicles may be hidden on your property. Vehicles connected to a decades-old theft that we've recently reopened." "I don't know what you're talking about," Thomas said, though the lie felt transparent on his lips. Agent Chen consulted a small notebook. "We've received credible information suggesting that items stolen from the Whitmore estate in 1969 may be located in agricultural buildings on this property. Are you familiar with that case?" Thomas's legs felt weak. He sank onto the couch across from the agents, his mind spinning. Who could have known? Who could have talked? The only person he'd told was Sarah, and she would never... "Mr. Fletcher?" Agent Morrison leaned forward. "We can do this the easy way or the hard way, but either way, we're going to need to search your property." The rain had stopped by the time Marcus drove back to the farmhouse, but the clouds still hung low and threatening. He parked beside Sarah's rental car and sat for a moment, staring at the weathered structure his grandfather had built with his own hands. Everything looked different now. The sagging porch, the peeling paint, even the old oak tree seemed to lean away from the house, as if it too carried the weight of buried secrets. Sarah met him at the door, her face tight with concern. "Where did you go? You just disappeared." "I needed to think." Marcus pushed past her into the kitchen, where the manila envelope still lay open on the table like an accusation. "Did you know?" "Know what?" He turned to face his sister, studying her expression for any hint of deception. "About the cars, about what Grandpa really did during the war." Sarah's shoulders sagged. "I suspected something wasn't right. When I was researching the property value for the developers, I found some inconsistencies in the historical records. Gaps in Grandpa's employment history, unexplained income in the late 1940s. She sat heavily in one of the mismatched kitchen chairs. "But I never imagined this." Marcus pulled out his phone and showed her the photos he'd taken in the barn. Sarah's hand flew to her mouth as she scrolled through images of the hidden Packard, the false wall, the carefully preserved crime scene from 7 decades ago. "My God," she whispered. "There are more cars?" "At least one. Maybe others." Marcus slumped against the counter. "The question is, what do we do about it?" Before Sarah could answer, gravel crunched in the driveway. Through the kitchen window, they watched a black sedan pull up behind their cars. 2 figures emerged, a woman in her 50s wearing a crisp business suit, and a younger man with the unmistakable bearing of law enforcement despite his civilian clothes. "Expecting company?" Sarah asked. Marcus shook his head, quickly gathering the photographs and documents back into the envelope. The knock on the front door came 3 sharp raps, authoritative and impatient. The woman smiled when Marcus opened the door, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Mr. Patterson, I'm Detective Linda Hartwell, and this is Agent Tom Rodriguez from the FBI's art crime team. We'd like to speak with you about some vehicles that may be located on your property." Marcus felt his stomach drop, but he kept his expression neutral. "I'm sorry, I don't understand." "May we come in?" Agent Rodriguez stepped forward slightly, not quite crossing the threshold, but making his presence felt. "We have some questions about your grandfather's activities during the 1940s. Sarah appeared behind Marcus, her lawyer instincts kicking in. "Do you have a warrant?" Detective Hartwell's smile grew sharper. "We're hoping this can remain a voluntary conversation, Miss Patterson. We understand you're both dealing with your grandfather's recent passing. We're not here to cause additional grief, but you will if we don't cooperate," Marcus said. "Let's not jump to conclusions," Rodriguez interjected smoothly. "We're investigating a cold case involving stolen automobiles from the post-war period. Your grandfather's name came up in some old files we're reviewing." Marcus glanced at Sarah, who gave an almost imperceptible nod. They stepped aside to let the investigators enter. In the kitchen, Detective Hartwell's gaze immediately went to the manila envelope on the table. "I see you've been going through your grandfather's papers." "Family documents," Sarah said carefully. "Estate matters." Rodriguez wandered toward the back window, his attention drawn to the barn visible across the yard. "That's a substantial outbuilding. Original to the property?" "Built in the 1930s, Marcus replied, his mouth dry. "Mind if we take a look?" The request hung in the air like a blade. Marcus realized they were at a crossroads: cooperate now and possibly control the narrative, or refuse and guarantee a return visit with warrants and search teams. "What exactly are you looking for?" Sarah asked. Detective Hartwell pulled out a tablet and showed them a black-and-white photograph of a pristine 1941 Packard. This vehicle was reported stolen from a private collection in Chicago in 1947. The owner died in 1983, but his estate recently hired a recovery firm to track down the missing cars. 3 other vehicles from the same collection have been recovered over the past 2 years. "And you think our grandfather was involved?" Marcus tried to inject disbelief into his voice. "We know he was employed briefly by a transportation company that later came under investigation for insurance fraud," Rodriguez said. "The company folded before charges could be filed, and several employees disappeared, including your grandfather. He returned to Illinois and bought this farm," Marcus thought, the timeline clicking into place. "Look," Detective Hartwell said, her tone becoming more conciliatory, "if there are stolen vehicles on this property, cooperation will go a long way toward determining intent and culpability. Your grandfather's been dead for what, 2 weeks? The statute of limitations on the original theft has long since expired." Marcus looked at Sarah one more time, seeing his own resignation reflected in her eyes. "All right," he said quietly, "let's go to the barn." The morning sun cast long shadows across the barn as Frank stood frozen, staring at the gleaming chrome bumper that protruded from beneath the rotted top. His coffee had gone cold in his trembling hands, and somewhere in the distance he could hear the rumble of Marcus Webb's pickup truck approaching down the gravel drive. He should have covered it back up, should have pretended he'd never seen it, but his feet remained planted to the spot, as if the weight of 40 years had suddenly settled on his shoulders like lead. The truck door slammed, followed by the crunch of boots on gravel. "Morning, Frank," Marcus called out, his voice carrying that practiced cheer of a man trying to close a deal. "Hope you don't mind me stopping by early, but I've got some revised numbers I think you'll want to hear." Frank forced himself to turn away from the barn, pulling the heavy doors closed behind him with more force than necessary. The metal hinges groaned in protest, a sound that seemed to echo his own internal struggle. "Told you yesterday, Webb. Property ain't for sale." He walked toward the house, hoping to lead Marcus away from the barn, away from questions he wasn't ready to answer. But Marcus was persistent, falling into step beside him. "Now hold on there, partner. These new figures are something else entirely. We're talking 12 million now, cash offer. That's enough to buy yourself a nice place in town, maybe Florida, and still have more money than you could spend in 3 lifetimes. 12 million. The number hit Frank like a physical blow. Yesterday it had been 8, the day before 5. They weren't just raising the stakes, they were getting desperate. "What's so damn special about my land?" Frank stopped walking and fixed Marcus with a hard stare. It's just dirt and weeds. Half the county's got better soil than this. Something flickered across Marcus's face, there and gone so quickly Frank almost missed it. Fear, maybe, or guilt. Well now, that's not entirely true. The location's prime for development. Easy highway access, good water table, plus you know how these city folks are about that authentic rural experience. Frank wasn't buying it. He'd lived here his whole life, worked this land until his back bent and his hands cracked like old leather. There was nothing special about these 200 acres, except for what lay hidden in that barn. My daddy built this place with his own 2 hands, Frank said, watching Marcus's reaction carefully. Course, that was long after the war. He came back different, never talked much about what happened over there. Lot of men came back changed, Marcus replied, but his eyes had shifted toward the barn. War does that to people, makes them do things they wouldn't normally do. The words hung between them like smoke, heavy with implication. Frank felt his pulse quicken. What kind of things? Marcus caught himself, that salesman's smile sliding back into place like a mask. Nothing specific, just speaking generally. But hey, that's all in the past, right? What matters now is your future. $12 million worth of future. A car engine rumbled in the distance, growing louder. Frank recognized the sound of Sheriff Kowalski's cruiser before it came into view around the bend. The timing couldn't be worse, or better, depending on how you looked at it. Marcus's jaw tightened as the sheriff's car pulled up beside his truck. Wasn't expecting company, he said, and Frank caught the edge in his voice. Sheriff Kowalski emerged from the cruiser, his weathered face grim. He nodded to Marcus but focused his attention on Frank. Got a minute to talk? Alone? I was just leaving anyway, Marcus said quickly, pulling out a business card and pressing it into Frank's hand. Think about that offer, Frank. Really think about it. Some opportunities don't come around twice. He climbed back into his truck and drove off, gravel spraying from his tires. Frank watched until the vehicle disappeared before turning to face the sheriff. What's this about, Jim? Kowalski removed his hat, running fingers through grey hair. Got a call yesterday from the state police. They're reopening some old cases going back decades. Auto theft ring that operated through this area in the 70s and 80s. Frank's mouth went dry. That's so. Seems they never recovered about 30 vehicles. High-end classics mostly. Word is, they might have been stashed somewhere rural, waiting for the heat to die down. The sheriff's eyes fixed on Frank's. Heat that never did die down, as it turns out. Behind them, the barn seemed to loom larger, its shadows deeper. Frank could practically feel the weight of all that hidden chrome and steel pressing against the old wooden doors. Can't imagine why you'd be telling me this, Frank said carefully. Sheriff Kowalski put his hat back on, adjusting the brim against the morning sun. Just figured you should know they'll be canvassing the area soon. Asking questions. Might want to make sure everything on your property is exactly how it should be. The morning sun cast long shadows across the barn as Walter stood frozen in the doorway, watching strangers crawl over his life's work like ants on spilled honey. Detective Morrison had arrived with a full forensics team, their white coveralls and evidence bags transforming his sanctuary into a crime scene. Mr. Brennan, we're going to need you to stay back while we process everything, Morrison said, her voice gentler than it had been the night before. This could take several hours. Walter nodded numbly, his weathered hands trembling as he gripped his coffee mug. Beside him, Sarah placed a protective arm around his shoulders, but he barely felt it. All he could see were the technicians photographing every inch of the Mustang, dusting for prints that would likely lead nowhere after 40 years. Grandpa, Sarah whispered, maybe we should go inside. Let them do their work. But Walter couldn't move. Watching them dismantle his carefully guarded secret felt like watching his own autopsy. Each flash of the camera, each evidence bag sealed and labeled, stripped away another layer of the life he'd built on this foundation of lies. A commotion near the property line caught his attention. 3 black SUVs had pulled up to the main gate, and Walter's stomach dropped as he recognized the lead figure stepping out. Marcus Holloway moved with the confidence of a man who'd never been told no, his expensive suit incongruous against the rural backdrop. "What's he doing here?" Sarah asked, following Walter's gaze. "Vultures circle when they smell death," Walter muttered. Holloway approached with two men Walter didn't recognize. One looked like private security, the other carried himself like law enforcement. Morrison intercepted them before they could reach the barn. "This is an active crime scene," Morrison announced. "I'll need you to maintain your distance." "Of course, Detective," Holloway replied smoothly. "I'm simply here to check on Mr. Brennan. We've had business dealings, and when I heard about this unfortunate situation..." He spread his hands in a gesture of concern that fooled no one. Walter felt his jaw clench. "Like hell you are." Holloway's eyes found Walter across the yard, and his expression shifted subtly. "Walter, I had no idea you were dealing with such complications. Perhaps now would be a good time to reconsider my offer. I'm prepared to be very generous, given the circumstances." "The circumstances?" Sarah stepped forward, her voice sharp. "What exactly do you know about the circumstances, Mr. Holloway?" "Only what I've heard through channels. Old property, old secrets. It happens more often than you'd think in my line of work." Holloway's smile didn't reach his eyes. "I'm simply offering a way out of what could become a very messy situation." Morrison moved closer to the group, her hand resting casually near her weapon. "Mr. Holloway, unless you have information relevant to this investigation, I suggest you conduct your business elsewhere." "Actually," said the man Walter hadn't recognized, stepping forward with a badge, "I'm Agent Chen, FBI. We might have some questions for Mr. Holloway as well." The temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. Holloway's composure cracked slightly, and Walter caught a glimpse of something predatory beneath the polished exterior. "I'm afraid I don't understand," Holloway said carefully. "I'm simply a developer making a legitimate offer." "A developer with connections to several vintage car theft rings from the 1970s and 80s, Agent Chen replied matter-of-factly. "Rings that specialized in high-end vehicles that were then stored for decades until the heat died down." Walter's coffee mug slipped from his fingers, shattering on the concrete. The pieces lay scattered like his understanding of the situation. This wasn't just about his father's crimes anymore. It was about something much larger, much more dangerous. "You knew," Walter said, the words coming out as barely a whisper. "You knew what was in that barn." Holloway's mask slipped completely now, revealing cold calculation. "I suspected. Your family's reputation preceded them in certain circles, but suspicion isn't proof, and I'm still prepared to make this problem disappear. For all of us." "Is that a threat?" Morrison asked, her voice deadly quiet. "It's a business proposition," Holloway replied, but his eyes never left Walter's, "one that benefits everyone involved. Mr. Brennan gets his money, I get my development, and certain embarrassing questions don't need to be asked." Sarah moved protectively in front of her grandfather. "Get off our property, now." Holloway straightened his tie, his composure returning like armor sliding back into place. "Of course. But Walter, my offer stands. Think carefully about your options. Some secrets are better buried than exposed." As the SUVs disappeared down the dirt road, Walter sank onto an old milk crate, suddenly feeling every one of his 78 years. The web his father had woven was more complex than he'd ever imagined, and now he was caught in its center, with his granddaughter beside him. "Grandpa?" Sarah's voice seemed to come from very far away. "What aren't you telling me?" The morning light filtered through the barn's broken slats, casting prison bar shadows across the concrete floor where Frank had discovered the hidden chamber. He stood at the edge of the opening, coffee steaming in his weathered hands, staring down at the vintage cars that had upended his entire world overnight. Sleep had been impossible. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw his father's face, not the kind, hard-working man he'd remembered, but someone else entirely, someone capable of secrets that spanned decades. The sound of gravel crunching outside made him freeze. Through the gaps in the barn wall, he watched Detective Morrison's unmarked sedan pull into his driveway, followed by what looked like a crime scene van. His pulse quickened. How had they found out so fast? Frank set down his coffee and walked to the barn entrance, intercepting Morrison before she could reach the farmhouse door. "Morning, Detective," he called out, hoping his voice sounded steadier than he felt. "You're up early." Morrison turned, her sharp eyes taking in his rumpled clothes and the defensive way he positioned himself between her and the barn. "Mr. Kowalski, I hope you don't mind the unexpected visit, but we've had some developments in our investigation." Two technicians emerged from the van, carrying equipment Frank couldn't identify, but looked expensive and official. His mouth went dry. "What kind of developments?" "We've been working with the FBI's art crime team," Morrison explained, pulling out a tablet, cross-referencing the car descriptions from the insurance files with other databases. "It turns out 3 of the vehicles we're looking for have very specific identifying marks, custom modifications that would be impossible to replicate." She swiped the screen and showed him a black and white photograph of a sleek sports car. This 1961 Ferrari 250 GT, for instance. The original owner had a small dent repaired on the rear quarter panel using a very specific technique that was only used by one shop in Chicago. The repair created a distinctive pattern in the metal that would show up under the right kind of scan. Frank's heart hammered against his ribs. He'd seen that car. It was sitting 20 feet away, hidden beneath decades of dust and family shame. "That's interesting," he managed. "But I'm not sure why you're telling me this." Morrison's eyes never left his face. "Because we've developed some leads that suggest the cars might still be in this area. We're planning to conduct more thorough searches of properties that were owned by families with connections to the auto industry in the 1960s. One of the technicians approached with what looked like a handheld scanner. "Ma'am, we're ready to begin the preliminary sweep." Frank felt the world tilting beneath his feet. "Sweep?" "Ground-penetrating radar," Morrison explained casually. "It can detect large metal objects buried underground or hidden in structures. We have warrants to search several properties in the county, including yours." She handed him a folded document. Frank's hands trembled as he unfolded it, though he couldn't focus on the legal language. The words blurred together as panic rose in his throat. "This seems excessive," he said, fighting to keep his voice level. "My property has been in my family for generations. We've never had anything to do with stolen cars." "I'm sure that's true," Morrison replied, but her tone suggested otherwise. "This is just routine elimination. Help us rule out your property, and we can focus our efforts elsewhere." The technician with the scanner was already walking toward the barn. Frank watched helplessly as the man adjusted settings on his device, completely unaware that he was about to uncover the biggest case of his career. Actually, Frank heard himself say, "There's something I need to tell you." Morrison raised an eyebrow. "Oh?" The words stuck in his throat. Once he said them, there would be no taking them back. His father's memory would be forever tainted, the family name dragged through the mud. The farm, assuming it wasn't seized as evidence, would become worthless, a tourist curiosity associated with crime and scandal. But the alternative was worse, being caught in a lie, being treated as an accomplice, possibly facing charges himself for concealing evidence. "Last night," he began slowly, "I was doing some cleaning in the old barn, moving things around, and I found—" He swallowed hard. "I found something I think you need to see." Morrison's posture shifted, becoming more alert. "What kind of something?" Frank looked back at the barn, then at the detective's expectant face. In the distance, he could see David's car approaching on the county road, his son coming for their planned breakfast, completely unaware that everything was about to change. "Cars," Frank said quietly. "I found the cars." The scanner in the technician's hands began beeping rapidly as he passed it over the barn's concrete floor, the electronic sound cutting through the morning air like an alarm bell, announcing the end of everything Frank had ever believed about his family. The morning sun cast long shadows across the barn, as Detective Morrison pulled up the gravel drive, her unmarked sedan crunching over loose stones. Frank watched from his kitchen window, coffee growing cold in his weathered hands. He'd been expecting this visit since yesterday's confrontation with his nephew. Tommy sat at the kitchen table, his lawyer briefcase open, papers scattered like fallen leaves. "Remember what we discussed, Uncle Frank? Short answers, don't volunteer information." Frank grunted, setting down his mug. "I've got nothing to hide." "That's exactly what you shouldn't say." The detective's knock came firm and professional. Frank opened the door to find Morrison flanked by a younger officer he didn't recognize. She wore the same serious expression that had become familiar over the past weeks, but something sharper lurked behind her eyes. "Mr. Kowalski, we need to talk about your brother Eddie." Frank stepped aside, gesturing them into the cramped kitchen. Morrison's gaze swept the room, taking inventory of every detail. The younger officer positioned himself near the door, notepad ready. "Coffee?" Frank offered, though his voice carried no warmth. "This isn't a social call." Morrison settled into the chair across from Tommy, who'd introduced himself with practiced efficiency. "We've been digging into your family's history, Mr. Kowalski. Found some interesting records from 1962. Frank's jaw tightened. Ancient history. "Murder isn't ancient history. It doesn't have a statute of limitations." She pulled out a manila folder, extracting a yellowed police report. "Your brother Eddie disappeared in August 1962. Same time period those cars were stolen. Funny coincidence." Tommy leaned forward. "What exactly are you suggesting, Detective?" Morrison ignored the lawyer, keeping her focus on Frank. Eddie worked at Harrison Motors, had access to keys, knew the security routine. 3 vintage cars went missing over 2 weeks, then Eddie vanished. Never seen again. The kitchen fell silent, except for the steady tick of the wall clock. Frank stared at his hands, remembering Eddie's nervous energy those last days, the way he jumped at every sound. "Eddie wasn't a thief," Frank said finally. "No? Then where did those cars come from? How did they end up buried on your property?" Morrison's voice remained level, but Frank caught the predatory patience underneath. "We found fingerprints, Mr. Kowalski. Partial prints on the steering wheel of the Corvette. They match prints from Eddie's military service record." Frank felt the walls closing in. Across the table, Tommy scribbled notes, probably calculating billable hours and damage control strategies. "My client has already stated he has no knowledge of how those vehicles—" "Your client's lying." Morrison slammed the folder shut. "Eddie stole those cars. Question is, was Frank here helping him, or did something else happen?" The younger officer shifted near the door, hand drifting toward his radio. Frank recognized the signs. They were preparing for an arrest. His mind raced back to that August night, Eddie's face pale in the porch light, keys jangling in his trembling fingers. "You want to know what happened?" Frank stood abruptly, chair scraping against linoleum. "I'll tell you what happened. Uncle Frank." Tommy's warning came too late. Eddie was scared. "Came here that night talking crazy about owing money to the wrong people. Said he'd borrowed against anticipated earnings, gambling debts mostly. When the cars didn't sell as quickly as he'd hoped, the interest kept climbing." Morrison leaned back, sensing breakthrough. "So, he did steal them?" Frank nodded slowly. 3 cars over 2 weeks. Eddie thought he could sell them fast, pay off his debts, return the money to the dealership before anyone noticed. But vintage car buyers were scarcer than he'd expected. Where is Eddie now? The question hung in the air like smoke. Frank walked to the window, gazing toward the back pasture where they'd found the cars. Beyond that, hidden by a copse of oak trees, lay the family cemetery. Unmarked graves from the old country when burial permits weren't required. "Eddie's gone," Frank said quietly. "Has been for 60 years. Gone where?" Morrison pressed. Frank turned back to face her. His debts weren't just to bookies. Eddie got mixed up with some Detroit muscle, guys who didn't accept late payments. They came looking for him that night, after he'd already buried the cars, planning to dig them up once the heat died down. And And they found him first. Frank's voice cracked slightly. Beat him to death right here in this kitchen. I came home from town, found Eddie on the floor, 2 men standing over him. The kitchen fell dead silent. Morrison and her partner exchanged glances. What happened to these men? Frank met her gaze steadily. Sometimes a man protects his family. Sometimes a man does what needs doing, regardless of consequences. Tommy dropped his pen. Outside, a crow cawed harshly from the barn roof. Frank Kowalski, Morrison said, reaching for her handcuffs, "You're under arrest." The silence stretched between them like a taut wire, ready to snap. Harold's weathered hands trembled as he set down his coffee cup, the ceramic rattling against the saucer. Sarah watched her grandfather's face crumble, decades of carefully constructed lies finally weighing too heavily to bear. "You want the truth?" Harold's voice cracked. "The truth is I've been living with blood on my hands for 53 years. Detective Morrison leaned forward, his notepad forgotten. Even the wind outside seemed to still, as if nature itself was holding its breath. "It was 1971, Harold began, his eyes fixed on something far beyond the kitchen walls. "I was 28, married to your grandmother for barely 2 years. We were struggling to keep this place afloat. The farm was failing just like it is now. Banks were circling like vultures." Sarah reached across the table, but Harold pulled his hands away, folding them in his lap like a penitent child. "A man came to see me. Called himself Vincent Torres. Slick dresser, expensive car. Said he had a business proposition that could solve all my problems. All I had to do was let him store some vehicles in my barn for a few months. $500 a month cash, no questions asked." "The stolen cars," Morrison said quietly. Harold nodded, his shoulders sagging. "I knew they weren't legitimate. You don't pay that kind of money for honest storage. But we were desperate. The bank was threatening foreclosure. Your grandmother was pregnant with your father, and the doctor bills—" He trailed off, lost in the weight of old justifications. "So you agreed," Sarah prompted, her voice barely a whisper. "I agreed. Torres and his crew brought in 12 cars over 3 months. Beautiful machines, Mustangs, Corvettes, a Jaguar E-Type. They worked on them in my barn, changing serial numbers, repainting them. I told myself I was just providing space, that I wasn't really part of it." Morrison's pen moved across the notepad. "What went wrong?" Harold's face went ashen. "There was a kid, Bobby Chen. Couldn't have been more than 19. He was part of Torres's crew, but he was different. Nervous. Kept talking about wanting out, about how they'd gone too far with something." The old man's hands began to shake more violently. Sarah wanted to comfort him, but the growing horror of his story held her frozen in place. "One night, Bobby came to me alone. Said he knew about a car they'd stolen that had a dead body in the trunk. Some businessman who'd walked in on them during a heist. Bobby was terrified, said he wanted to go to the police. But he didn't," Morrison observed. "He never got the chance." Harold's voice dropped to barely audible. "Torres found out about Bobby's visit. The next morning they came for him, right here in my yard. Torres had Bobby on his knees in the dirt, gun to his head, said he was a liability." Sarah's hand flew to her mouth. "Grandpa, no." "Torres looked at me and said I had a choice. I could be part of the solution or I could be part of the problem. He handed me the gun." Harold's entire body was shaking now. "Said if I wanted to keep my farm, my family safe, I had to prove my loyalty." The kitchen fell silent except for the tick of the old clock on the wall. Morrison set down his pen, his expression grave. "I told myself I didn't have a choice," Harold whispered. "That if I didn't do it, Torres would kill us both, maybe come after my wife. I told myself I was protecting my family." "Where is Bobby Chen buried?" Morrison asked gently. "Northfield, under what's now the old apple orchard. I planted those trees myself that fall, thinking they'd be a memorial of sorts. Torres and his crew disappeared that same week, left the cars behind. Said the heat was too much, they'd come back for them later, but they never did. Torres was arrested in Chicago 6 months later. Shot dead trying to escape. The others scattered. I waited for someone to come looking for the cars for Bobby, but nobody ever came. It was like he never existed. Sarah finally found her voice. All these years, you've been living with this? Your grandmother knew something was wrong, but I never told her the details. Told her the cars belonged to a friend in financial trouble. She believed me because she wanted to. When she got sick, when your father needed money for college, when this place needed repairs, that money from Torres, it paid for everything. Everything you have, everything your father accomplished, it's all built on that boy's grave. Morrison closed his notepad slowly. Mr. Jameson, you understand I have to arrest you? Harold nodded, a strange peace settling over his features. I've been waiting 53 years for someone to say those words. Maybe now Bobby Chen can finally rest. The barn felt different now that Detective Morrison and his team had catalogued every vehicle, photographed every angle, and dusted every surface for prints. What had once been Harold's sanctuary of secrets now buzzed with the clinical efficiency of a crime scene investigation. Harold stood in the doorway, watching strangers treat his father's legacy like evidence, which he supposed it was. Mr. Whitmore, Morrison approached with a manila folder tucked under his arm. We need to talk. They walked toward the farmhouse, leaving behind the controlled chaos of the investigation. Sarah met them on the porch, her face drawn with exhaustion. She'd barely slept since the discovery, and Harold could see the weight of everything pressing down on her shoulders. The VIN numbers tell quite a story, Morrison began, settling into one of the old wicker chairs that creaked under his weight. 12 vehicles reported stolen between 1963 and 1967. All high-end cars taken from wealthy neighborhoods in the city. The insurance payouts alone totaled over $2 million in today's money. Harold's hands trembled as he lit his pipe. My father wasn't a thief. The evidence suggests otherwise. Morrison opened the folder and spread several photographs across the small table. But here's what's interesting. The thefts stopped abruptly in late 1967. Whoever was running this operation just quit. Sarah leaned forward, studying the images. That's when my grandfather died. Harold's told me the stories. Heart attack during harvest season. Convenient timing, Morrison mused. We've been digging into the original investigations. Back then, the police suspected an organized ring, but they could never find the cars. Most assumed they'd been chopped up and sold for parts immediately. A black sedan pulled into the driveway, kicking up dust that caught the afternoon light. Harold recognized the car immediately. It belonged to Richard Chen, the lead developer who'd been pressuring him to sell. But Chen wasn't alone. A woman in an expensive suit emerged from the passenger side, her sharp eyes already surveying the property. Vultures, Sarah muttered. Chen approached with his practiced smile, though it faltered when he noticed Morrison's badge. Mr. Whitmore, I hope this isn't a bad time. This is Miss Catherine Valdez, our legal counsel. Actually, it's a terrible time. Morrison stood, his hand instinctively moving toward his holster. This is an active crime scene. Valdez stepped forward, her voice crisp and professional. We're aware of the situation, Detective. Our legal team has been following the case. We believe our client still has valid interests regarding this property. Harold felt something cold settle in his stomach. What kind of interests? Insurance fraud, Chen said simply. If your family was involved in theft and fraud dating back decades, it could invalidate your property titles. The statute of limitations doesn't apply to ongoing conspiracies. Morrison's jaw tightened. Are you threatening this man? We're protecting our investment, Valdez replied smoothly. Pembroke Development has already committed significant resources to this area based on projections that included this property. If criminal activity has tainted the land rights, we need to explore our legal options. Sarah stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the wooden planks. You're despicable. You're trying to steal his land because he wouldn't sell it to you. We're following the law, Chen said. Your grandfather's crimes don't disappear just because he's dead. Harold watched the exchange with growing dread. He'd spent his entire life building something clean and honest from what his father had left behind. Now these people wanted to tear it all down, using his father's sins as leverage. "Get off my property," Harold said quietly. Chen's smile returned. "Mr. Whitmore, be reasonable. We can still make this work for everyone. Sell to us now before the legal complications multiply, and we'll offer fair market value. Fight us in court, and you might lose everything anyway." Morrison stepped between them. "You heard him. Time to go." As the developers retreated to their car, Valdez called back, "You have 48 hours to consider our offer. After that, our legal team takes a more aggressive approach." The sedan disappeared down the road, leaving behind the acrid smell of exhaust and the bitter taste of threatened litigation. Harold sank back into his chair, feeling every one of his 73 years settling into his bones. "They can't just steal your land," Sarah said fiercely. "They don't have to steal it," Harold replied. "If they can prove my father was part of an ongoing criminal enterprise, they might argue that the property was purchased with stolen money. Everything becomes questionable." Morrison folded his papers back into the folder. "We'll need to examine your father's financial records, property purchases, anything that might establish a timeline. The truth might be your best defense." Harold nodded slowly, though he wondered if the truth would save him or destroy everything he'd spent his lifetime trying to build. His father's secrets had already cost him more than he'd imagined possible, and the vultures were only beginning to circle. The morning sun cast long shadows across the farmyard as Samuel adjusted his worn flannel shirt and stepped onto the porch. 3 days had passed since Detective Morrison's visit, and the weight of decades-old secrets pressed heavier on his shoulders with each sunrise. The coffee in his mug had grown cold, but he barely noticed, his weathered hands trembling slightly as he gripped the ceramic. A dust cloud appeared on the horizon, growing larger as it approached down the gravel drive. Samuel's chest tightened when he recognized the sleek black sedan. Morrison was returning, and he wasn't alone. A second vehicle followed, this one a white van with official markings that Samuel couldn't quite make out from this distance. "Damn," he muttered, setting down his mug with more force than necessary. The vehicles pulled to a stop near the barn, and Morrison emerged from the sedan with 2 men Samuel didn't recognize. One carried a briefcase, the other what appeared to be some kind of electronic equipment. From the van came 3 more officials, their movements purposeful and coordinated in a way that made Samuel's stomach churn. Morrison approached the porch while the others hung back, their eyes scanning the property with professional interest. "Mr. Garrett, I hope you've had time to consider our conversation from the other day." Samuel remained seated, though every instinct told him to bolt. "Considered it plenty." "Still don't know what you're talking about." "I think you do." Morrison pulled a folded paper from his jacket pocket. "This is a search warrant for your property, specifically the barn and any outbuildings. We have reason to believe stolen vehicles are being stored here." "You won't find anything recent," Samuel said quietly, surprising himself with his honesty. Morrison paused, studying the old farmer's face. "Recent? What exactly will we find, Mr. Garrett?" Samuel closed his eyes, seeing his father's face from that night 47 years ago when everything changed. Theodore Garrett had been a good man who'd made one terrible mistake, and Samuel had spent nearly 5 decades protecting that memory. But the weight was becoming unbearable, especially now that Margaret's future hung in the balance. "My father," Samuel began, his voice barely above a whisper, "he wasn't always a farmer." Morrison waited, sensing the importance of letting Samuel tell it his way. "During the war, he worked at a garage in town. Good with engines, could fix anything. After he got back, things were difficult. Money was tight, we nearly lost the farm twice." Samuel's hands worked nervously at the fabric of his pants. "He got involved with some men from the city, started storing cars for them, no questions asked. Said it was temporary, just until we got back on our feet." The sound of the barn doors creaking open carried across the yard, followed by excited voices. Morrison glanced toward the commotion but kept his attention on Samuel. "One night in 1976, my father came home scared, said something had gone wrong, that the men he'd been working with were dangerous. He made me promise to never speak of what was in the barn, said it would destroy our family if anyone found out. Samuel's voice cracked slightly. He died of a heart attack 3 weeks later. I was 19, inheriting a farm and a secret I never wanted. Morrison sat down heavily in the chair beside Samuel. How many cars? 4, maybe 5. I stopped looking after the first few years. Samuel met Morrison's eyes for the first time. I know I should have called the police back then, but I was young and scared. My father had just died, and I couldn't bear the thought of his name being dragged through the mud. As the years went by, it just got harder to tell the truth. A shout from the barn interrupted them. One of the investigators was waving Morrison over, his excitement evident even from a distance. Morrison stood but didn't immediately leave. Mr. Garrett, I need you to know that your cooperation today will be noted. The statute of limitations on receiving stolen property may have run out, but we'll need your full statement about everything you know. Samuel nodded, feeling an unexpected sense of relief washing over him. Detective, those developers who want to buy my land. They're going to have a field day with this, aren't they? That's not my concern right now. But Samuel, Morrison used his first name deliberately, you did the right thing telling me, finally. As Morrison walked toward the barn, Samuel remained on the porch, watching his carefully constructed life begin to unravel. In the distance, Margaret's pickup truck appeared on the horizon, returning from town. Soon, he'd have to explain everything to the granddaughter, who meant more to him than his own reputation. The truth was finally emerging from its decades-long hiding place, and Samuel Garrett could only hope that some things were worth preserving when the dust settled. The fluorescent lights in the police station interrogation room cast harsh shadows across Henry's weathered face as Detective Morrison slid a thick manila folder across the metal table. The sound echoed in the sterile space, followed by the soft thud of photographs spilling out, black and white images from 1987, crime scene photos, and newer pictures of the vintage cars from his barn. Your brother Carl was quite the entrepreneur, Morrison said, settling into his chair. Small-time fence operations, stolen merchandise, some suspected involvement in organized crime circles, but nothing like this. Henry's fingers trembled as he picked up one of the older photographs. Carl stood beside a gleaming Mustang, his cocky grin frozen in time. I thought he was just working construction jobs in the city. He'd come home every few months with money, said business was good. Business was good, all right. We've traced these vehicles to a sophisticated theft ring that operated throughout the Northeast. High-end classics, stolen to order, then stored until the heat died down. Morrison leaned forward. What we can't figure out is why they stayed in your barn for 35 years. The door opened, and Sarah entered with her lawyer, a sharp-eyed woman in an expensive suit. Henry felt a pang of guilt seeing his daughter's pale complexion and the dark circles under her eyes. This was destroying her life, just as he'd feared. "Dad, tell them everything," Sarah said, taking the seat beside him. "Whatever Carl did, you're not responsible for his crimes." Henry closed his eyes, remembering that October night when everything changed. The autumn wind had been howling through the gaps in the barn siding, and Carl had arrived after midnight with a convoy of trucks. Henry had watched from his bedroom window as men unloaded car after car, Carl directing them with urgent gestures. "He came to me the next morning," Henry began, his voice barely above a whisper, "said he was in trouble, that some very dangerous people were after him. He begged me to keep quiet about the cars for just a few weeks until he could sort things out." Morrison made notes in his pad. But weeks turned into decades. Carl disappeared 3 days later. I found his note on the kitchen table, said he had to run, that men were coming to kill him, and if I ever saw anyone asking questions about cars, I should deny everything. Henry's hands shook as he reached into his jacket pocket and produced a yellowed piece of paper, folded and refolded countless times over the years. Sarah read over her father's shoulder, her lawyer scanning the handwriting with professional interest. The note was brief but desperate. "Henry, they found out about the storage operation. DiMarco's crew knows I was skimming. They'll torture you for information if they think you know anything. The cars aren't worth our lives. Destroy this note. Love you, brother. C. DeMarco, Morrison repeated, recognition flickering in his eyes. Vincent DeMarco ran one of the most violent crime families in New Jersey back then. He's been dead for 20 years, but in the 80s he was ruthless. I was terrified, Henry continued. Carl said if anyone came looking, our whole family could be killed, so when men in expensive suits showed up a week later asking about Carl, I told them I hadn't seen him. They searched the property but never thought to look in the old barn. It looked too run down to hide anything valuable. Sarah reached for her father's hand. Why didn't you just report everything to the police after they left? Henry's laugh was bitter. And tell them what? That my brother was a criminal and I'd been hiding evidence? That I'd lied to men who could have me killed? I was a coward, Sarah. I thought if I just waited long enough, it would all go away. Morrison studied the note again. The cars were essentially evidence in multiple felony cases. Owners collected insurance money. Some of these vehicles were connected to other crimes. Your silence allowed a lot of injustice to stand. I know that now, Henry said. Every year that passed made it harder to come forward. The cars became like ghosts in that barn, proof of my cowardice and my brother's crimes. The lawyer spoke for the first time. Detective Morrison, my client, was clearly acting under duress. He had reason to fear for his life and his family's safety. These were extraordinary circumstances. Morrison nodded thoughtfully. The statute of limitations has run out on most of the related charges anyway. What concerns me now is cooperation. Mr. Brennan, we need everything you remember about that night, about the men who came looking for Carl, about any other contact you might have had with these criminal organizations. I'll tell you everything I remember, he said firmly, every detail. The morning sun cast long shadows across the barn floor as Detective Martinez spread the recovered documents across Harold's workbench. 3 generations of carefully maintained records lay before them, bills of sale, shipping manifests, and correspondence that painted a picture none of them had expected. Your grandfather wasn't just hiding stolen cars, Martinez said, her finger tracing a faded invoice. He was running a sophisticated operation to return them to their rightful owners. Harold's weathered hands trembled as he picked up a letter dated 1952, written in his grandfather's familiar scrawl. The words seemed to blur together as he read aloud, to the family of James Morrison, I have recovered your 1947 Packard, stolen from your Chicago home. Please find enclosed the location where you may retrieve your property, along with my sincere apologies for the delay in its return. Sarah moved closer, reading over his shoulder. There are dozens of these letters. Look at this. Receipts for mechanical work, new parts, restorations. He was fixing them up before giving them back. Martinez nodded, pulling out a thick ledger. According to this, your grandfather recovered over 200 stolen vehicles between 1949 and 1964. The cars in your barn were the ones he couldn't return. Either the owners had died, moved without forwarding addresses, or the insurance companies had already paid out claims and didn't want them back. Harold sank onto a crate, the weight of 15 years of resentment suddenly feeling unbearable. All this time I thought he was a criminal. That's why I never sold the property, why I let it fall apart. I was ashamed of what I thought he'd done. The irony, Martinez continued, is that Caldwell Development has been trying to buy your land because they suspected something valuable was hidden here. James Caldwell's father was involved with the original car theft ring your grandfather was fighting against. When the family business went legitimate, they never forgot about the cars that went missing from their operation. The detective held up a police report, yellowed with age. Your grandfather was working with law enforcement the whole time. He'd been a mechanic before the war, knew cars better than anyone. When the theft ring started operating in the county, he volunteered to help track down the stolen vehicles. Sarah's voice was barely a whisper. So the developers weren't just after the land. They wanted to recover what they considered their property, even after all these years. The legitimate car collectors who've been sniffing around, the break-ins, the pressure to sell, it's all connected. Harold stood slowly, walking to the barn door where he could see his field stretching toward the horizon. 16 cars left in there, 16 families who never got their property back. 17, actually, Martinez corrected. We found one more hidden under a tarp in the back corner, a 1955 Thunderbird that's probably worth more than your mortgage. The sound of tires on gravel interrupted them. Through the window, Harold watched a black sedan pull up beside Martinez's patrol car. A man in an expensive suit emerged, straightening his tie as he approached the barn. "Mr. Whitmore." The man's voice was smooth, professional. "I'm Attorney Davidson, representing the Caldwell family. I understand you've made some interesting discoveries on your property." Martinez stepped forward, her hand instinctively moving to her service weapon. "This is an active crime scene, sir. I'll have to ask you to leave." Davidson smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "I think you'll find that several of those vehicles legally belong to my clients. The Caldwell family has documentation proving ownership predating any alleged theft." "Forged documentation," Harold said, surprised by the steadiness in his own voice. "Just like the forged development contracts you've been waving around for months." The attorney's composure slipped slightly. "I'm not sure what you're implying, Mr. Whitmore, but I'm implying that your clients are the sons and grandsons of car thieves, and they're trying to steal from me the same way their fathers stole from dozens of innocent families 60 years ago." Harold pulled one of his grandfather's letters from the pile. "The difference is, I have proof." Martinez moved between them. "Mr. Davidson, I suggest you contact the district attorney's office if you want to pursue any claims. Right now, these vehicles are evidence in an ongoing investigation." As the attorney retreated to his car, Sarah touched Harold's arm. "What are you going to do? Even if the cars legally belong to you now, maintaining this place." Harold looked back at the documents scattered across the workbench, then at the barn where his grandfather's secret had waited patiently for someone to understand the truth. For the first time in years, the weight he'd been carrying felt lighter. "I'm going to finish what he started," he said. "Those families deserve to know what happened to their cars, even if it's too late to return them. And I'm going to make sure everyone knows that Thomas Whitmore was a good man." The confession room at the county sheriff's department felt smaller than a coffin, its fluorescent lights casting harsh shadows across Thomas Garrett's weathered face. Detective Rodriguez sat across from him, a digital recorder blinking red between them like a mechanical heartbeat, counting down the seconds until everything Thomas had protected for 47 years would finally see daylight. "Start wherever you're comfortable, Mr. Garrett," Rodriguez said, her voice gentler than it had been during the arrest. Even she seemed to understand the weight of what was about to unfold. Thomas cleared his throat, his calloused hands trembling slightly as they rested on the metal table. "My brother Eddie was always the charmer, could talk his way into anything, out of anything. I was the steady one, the one who stayed home and worked the farm while he ran around town with his schemes." He paused, staring at a water stain on the ceiling as if it might hold the answers to questions he'd been avoiding for decades. "Summer of 1976, Eddie came to me with what he called an opportunity. Said he'd found a way to make enough money to save the farm from foreclosure. Times were hard then. Drought had killed most of our crops, and the bank was circling like vultures." Rodriguez made a note but didn't interrupt. She'd learned that sometimes the best interrogation technique was simply letting people talk. "Eddie had fallen in with some boys from the city, professional thieves, though I didn't know that at first. He told me they needed a place to store some cars temporarily, classic vehicles that needed to be kept out of sight while paperwork got sorted. Said it was all legitimate business, just complicated." Thomas's voice cracked slightly. "I knew better. Deep down I knew Eddie was lying, but I wanted to believe him because we needed the money so desperately, $5,000 just to let them use the old tobacco barn for a few months. It seemed like a gift from heaven." The detective leaned forward slightly. "But you never asked questions about the cars?" I tried not to look too close at first. Eddie said the less I knew, the safer I'd be. But when they started bringing in more cars, beautiful machines, Mustangs and Corvettes and Camaros, I couldn't help but notice things. VIN numbers that looked tampered with, paint jobs that seemed too fresh, owners' manuals and registration papers scattered in the seats that didn't match the people who'd brought them. Thomas rubbed his temples, the weight of 47 years of deception pressing down on him. The plan was supposed to be simple. They'd store the cars for a few weeks, move them along to buyers in other states, and that would be the end of it. But then everything went sideways. What happened? Police started sniffing around. There'd been a string of high-end auto thefts in the region, and somehow they'd connected Eddie to one of the crews. He panicked, told his partners they needed to lay low for a while. A while turned into months, and months turned into years. Rodriguez nodded, understanding beginning to dawn in her expression. And you were stuck with the evidence. Eddie promised he'd come back for them. Said as soon as the heat died down, they'd move the cars and I'd get another payment for my trouble. But Eddie got himself killed in a bar fight in Atlanta 6 months later, and his criminal friends scattered to the wind. I never heard from any of them again. Thomas's voice grew quieter, more strained. I thought about calling the police then. Should have called them, but I was terrified. I'd been harboring stolen property for months, taking money for it. I had a wife and a baby daughter to think about. Prison would have destroyed what was left of our family. So you decided to bury the secret instead. Literally and figuratively, I welded those barn doors shut, told my wife the building was unsafe and needed to stay closed. Over the years, nature did the rest. Vines grew over it. Trees fell against it. It became invisible, just another piece of decay on a failing farm. Rodriguez studied his face carefully. And when your daughter Sarah found out about the development offer? Thomas winced as if she'd struck him. Sarah doesn't know about any of this. She's spent her whole career building a reputation as an honest businesswoman. This will destroy her, and she doesn't deserve that. She's only guilty of trying to help her stubborn old father. The developers, though, Marcus Webb, seemed very insistent about purchasing your specific property. I've been wondering about that myself, Thomas admitted. Could be coincidence, but lately I'm not so sure. Webb knew things about the farm's history that seemed odd for a regular developer. Asked specific questions about the old tobacco barn during our first meeting. The room fell silent except for the hum of the fluorescent lights. Thomas looked directly at Rodriguez for the first time since beginning his confession. I know I should have come forward years ago. I've lived with this guilt every single day, but I was too much of a coward to face the consequences. Rodriguez turned off the recorder. Mr. Garrett, I think there might be more to this story than you realize. The morning sun cast long shadows across the farmyard as Edgar sat on his porch, watching the investigators load the last of the vintage cars onto trailers. 3 weeks had passed since the discovery, and the property buzzed with activity that felt foreign after decades of solitude. Detective Morrison approached, her footsteps crunching on the gravel. That's the last of them, she said, settling onto the wooden steps beside him. 12 cars in total. The insurance companies are calling it one of the biggest recoveries in state history. Edgar nodded, his weathered hands wrapped around a coffee mug that had long since gone cold. Pop always said those cars were cursed. Guess he was right, just not in the way he meant. Morrison pulled out a manila folder, thick with documents. The investigation's wrapping up. Your father's been cleared of any criminal intent. The evidence shows he genuinely believed he was protecting stolen property until the rightful owners could be found. The statute of limitations has long passed anyway. And Tommy Castellano's family? Grateful, actually. They never knew what happened to him. Finding his remains gives them closure they've waited 70 years for. She paused, studying Edgar's weathered face. There's something else. The insurance payouts, the finder's fees. You're looking at substantial compensation. Edgar almost smiled. Enough to fix up this old place without selling to those developers? Enough to buy 3 places like this? The irony wasn't lost on him. His stubborn refusal to sell had led to a windfall that dwarfed the developer's offer, but the money felt hollow somehow. tainted by decades of family guilt and buried secrets. Sarah's truck pulled into the driveway, and Edgar watched his daughter emerge, her face showing the strain of the past weeks. She'd been fielding calls from reporters, lawyers, and curiosity seekers, protecting him from the worst of the attention. The revelation about their family's past had shaken her, but she'd stood by him through it all. "Dad," she called out, walking over with a newspaper tucked under her arm. "You made the front page again." She handed him the paper, and Edgar grimaced at the headline, "Farmer's Buried Treasure Solves Century-Old Mystery." Below it was a photo of his property, looking more alive than it had in years with all the activity. "Fame's overrated," he muttered. Detective Morrison stood, brushing dust from her pants. "I'll leave you two alone. Edgar, if you need anything, you have my number." She paused at her car. "For what it's worth, I think your father was a good man caught in an impossible situation. You should be proud of how this turned out." After Morrison left, Sarah sat where the detective had been. Father and daughter remained quiet for a moment, watching the dust settle on the now empty property. "The developers called again," Sarah said finally. "Up their offer by 20%. Word about the discovery has them thinking there might be more valuable finds on the property." Edgar shook his head. "Vultures. They smell opportunity in everything." "What are you going to do, Dad? With the insurance money, you could rebuild this place exactly how you want it. Or," she hesitated, "or you could start fresh somewhere else." He looked across the fields where corn had once grown tall, where his father had worked from dawn to dusk, carrying the weight of his secret. The land held pain, yes, but also generations of honest labor and quiet dignity. "You know what your grandfather's biggest regret was?" Edgar asked. "Not the cars, not the secret. It was that he never trusted anyone enough to share the burden. He carried it alone until it bent his back and broke his spirit." Sarah reached over and squeezed his hand. "You don't have to carry anything alone, Dad. I know that now." He stood slowly, his joints protesting. "Come on. I want to show you something." They walked to the old barn, empty now, except for farming equipment and years of accumulated memories. Edgar led her to a corner where loose floorboards revealed a small hiding space. "Found this after we cleared out the cars," he said, pulling out a metal box. Inside were dozens of letters, all addressed but never sent. Pop wrote to the families of every car owner, drafted them over and over, trying to find the right words to explain what happened. Sarah picked up one of the yellowed letters, scanning the careful handwriting. "I pray someday I'll have the courage to make this right," she read aloud. He never sent them because he was afraid. Afraid of prison, afraid of losing the farm, afraid of what people would think. Edgar closed the box gently. "I won't make the same mistake." "What do you mean?" Edgar looked around the barn, then back at his daughter. "We're going to rebuild this place, make it something Pop would be proud of. But first, I'm going to visit every family we can track down, face to face. They deserve to hear the whole story from us, not from newspaper headlines." Sarah smiled, the first genuine smile he'd seen from her in weeks. "When do we start?" "Tomorrow," Edgar said. "We start tomorrow." The morning sun cast long shadows across the farm as Thomas Hartwell stood on his front porch, watching the last of the police vehicles disappear down the dusty road. The yellow tape had been removed, the evidence catalogued, and the vintage cars, all 17 of them, loaded onto flatbed trucks bound for the state impound lot. After 43 years buried beneath his barn, his father's secret was finally gone. Margaret emerged from the kitchen, carrying 2 cups of coffee. Her silver hair caught the light as she settled beside him on the weathered swing they'd shared for over 30 years of marriage. "The insurance investigator called," she said quietly. "They've already identified 6 of the vehicles. The Shelby Cobra alone is worth nearly $2 million. Thomas nodded but said nothing. The numbers felt abstract, meaningless. What mattered was the weight that had lifted from his chest when Detective Morrison finally closed her notebook and shook his hand, confirming what his lawyer had already explained. The statute of limitations on his father's crimes had long since expired, and Thomas faced no charges for the discovery. "Mr. Hartwell?" a familiar voice called from the driveway. Thomas looked up to see David Chen approaching, but the developer's usual confident stride was replaced by something more hesitant. Gone was the expensive suit, replaced by jeans and a simple button-down shirt. He carried a manila folder in his hands. "I wasn't sure you'd want to see me," Chen said, stopping at the bottom of the porch steps. "Coffee's fresh," Margaret offered, though her tone remained cautious. Chen climbed the steps slowly. "I owe you both an apology. When I heard what happened, what you've been dealing with all these years, I realized how my pressure must have felt." Thomas studied the younger man's face. The calculating gleam was gone, replaced by something that looked like genuine remorse. "You were doing your job." "Maybe, but I was doing it badly." Chen opened the folder. "I've been thinking about what you said, about this land being more than just acreage and square footage. I think I understand now." He pulled out a set of architectural drawings. "What if we could honor both? Your family's legacy and the community's future?" Thomas frowned as Chen spread the papers on the porch table. Instead of the sprawling shopping complex he'd expected, the drawings showed something entirely different. A modest development of craftsman-style homes surrounding a central green space. At the heart of it all was a detailed rendering of the farmhouse, restored but fundamentally unchanged. "A heritage district," Chen explained. 24 homes maximum, each one built to complement the existing architecture. Your house would anchor the community, fully restored, with enough land around it to maintain the farm's character. Margaret leaned forward, studying the plans. "The old oak tree?" "Preserved, along with the original stone walls and the creek." Chen pointed to various elements on the drawing. "We'd even rebuild the barn. Not where where the old one stood, but closer to the house. Make it a community gathering space." Thomas felt his throat tighten. "Why?" "Because I was wrong. This place has value that can't be measured in dollars per square foot." Chen gathered the papers carefully. "The town council loves the concept. Lower density, higher value homes, preserved green space. And honestly, after seeing how you handled everything these past few weeks, the dignity you showed even when your whole world was falling apart, I couldn't live with myself if I bulldozed what you've built here." A red pickup truck turned into the driveway, and Thomas recognized his neighbor Jake Morrison behind the wheel. The detective had mentioned that her husband ran a restoration business, but Thomas hadn't expected a visit. Jake climbed out carrying a wooden toolbox. "Hope you don't mind me stopping by. Sarah told me about the barn and, well," he gestured toward the charred foundation. "I've been working with old timber my whole life. If you're thinking about rebuilding, I'd like to help." Margaret's eyes brightened. "That's very kind of you." "Not kind, practical. This community takes care of its own, and from what I hear, you folks have been taking care of this land for generations." Jake's weathered hands reminded Thomas of his own father's, before they'd been stained with guilt and secrets. Thomas looked around at the three faces watching him expectantly. For so long, he'd felt alone with the weight of his family's burden. Now, impossibly, he found himself surrounded by people offering not judgment, but partnership. "I'll need time to think," he said finally. Chen nodded, leaving the folder on the table. "Take all the time you need. This offer stands as long as you want it to." As the two men prepared to leave, Thomas felt Margaret's hands slip into his. The farm around them seemed different somehow, not the prison of secrets it had been for decades, but a foundation upon which something new might grow. "Thomas?" Margaret's voice was soft. "What do you think he would have wanted? Your father, I mean, if he could have seen past his mistakes?" Thomas squeezed her hand, watching the sun climb higher over the fields that had sheltered both shame and redemption. "I think," he said slowly, "he would have wanted us to build something better."